გამარჯობათ. მოდით დავიწყოთ ნელ-ნელა. მე დღეს წარმოგიდგენთ ჩვენი უბანის საჯარო პროგრამის მეორე ღონისძიებას, რომლებიც ამ სეზონში ესე გამოდის, რომ იქნება სულ 3. ასე რომ გამოიწერეთ ჩვენი სოციალური ქსელები და მალე გამოვაცხადებ შემდეგს. ასევე არსებობს არხი ჩვენი YouTube-ზე, სადაც იდება ჩვენი წინა ღონისძიებების ჩანაწერები. და ამჯერად მივესალმები ჩვენს ძვირფას მეგობარს, უბანის კოლაბორატორს, Ruderalis ხელმძღვანელს Sarah Cowles. როგორც წინა პრეზენტაციაზე მოგიყევით, ჩვენი უბანის მოღვაწეობის პირველი წელი მიუძღვნება ქალაქის ლანდშაფტს და ზუსტად იმიტომ გადავწყვიტეთ ამ თემის განხილვა, რომელსაც Sarah ზრუნავს, იკვლევს, აკეთებს პროექტებს და იმედია ძალიან საინტერესო ლექცია გველის. ასევე ლექციის მერე სცენაზე შეერთდება ლონდონის Special Affairs გუნდის ხელმძღვანელი პიტერ კალი. და გთხოვთ თქვენც მოგერიდებათ დავსვათ კითხვები, რომ რაღაც საინტერესო დისკუსია გამოვიდეს. დიდი მადლობა მინდა გადავხადო იერი Concept Stores და პირადად ანკა ციციშვილს, რომ შედგა ესეთი საინტერესო კოლაბორაცია, მულტიდისციპლინარული, ჩაატარეთ ლამაზესი გადაღება ამ ლამაზ დროს, როცა აყვავდა თბილისი და ამ მრავალფეროვანი მედით და ხერხებით ვცდილობთ გავავრცელოთ ამ თემის მნიშვნელობა, რომელიც არის ქალაქის ლანდშაფტი, თბილისის ურბანული ტყე და ძირითადად ქალაქის გამწვანება. კიდევ დიდი მადლობა კინოს სახლის კრეატიულ ხაბს, რომ დაგვითმოს სივრცე და მოდით დავიწყოთ. Sarah, I just made a small introduction and I give my word to you.
Thank you. And, thank you, Nata. And this is a really exciting event for me. I called Nata one day, I think a month ago, and I said, do we have some kind of collaboration we could do? Something, beyond the normal architecture and landscape kind of project. And she immediately thought of Yeri Store. She brought in Barry. And all of a sudden we were on the mountain taking photos. And this is such an exciting thing for us to have this motivation and this energy from everybody involved. Ani, Dato, Julia, Anka, Natalia, everybody. I'm leaving some people out and I'm really sorry. And also that Peter was also coming here to collaborate with me on some projects. So we decided to come together on this presentation today. So what I'm going to talk about today are 2 projects that we've completed in the past 2 years. One was for the Architecture Biennial. Thank you, Gigi and company, for that opportunity. And the second is the planting of the Tbilisi Urban Forest, which is a project sponsored by City Hall. And for me, these 2 projects represent different scales of looking at the city and how the city can advance and develop outside of just the architecture. And can help solve some of those issues in terms of loss of biodiversity, loss of the permeable spaces, the spaces that are not sealed over with concrete, etc. So I'm going to go through these projects in terms of their conception, as well as the implementation that we went through. And I think it'll also help maybe to understand how a landscape architect specifically looks at these types of projects that might be a bit different than an architect or a planner, for example. So I think, because we're really the one small landscape architecture studio in Tbilisi, in Georgia, right now. We've been really lucky to have these opportunities and to have architects who understand what we can bring to projects. And I'm also very thankful for our team. At this point, we have about 8 or 9 people, always changing who's involved, but none of these projects could be possible without a team of brilliant young designers. So a big thanks to them as well. So first project I'll talk about is Arsenal Oasis, which is located in Tbilisi Ubani. The project was conceptualized for the architecture biennial 2020. And there's 2 main ideas I'll talk about in this project. One is the idea of unsealing the city. This photo we took today up on Narikala Ridge, which is in Solaki. And you may see this all over the city, these places where the paving goes right up to the edge of the tree. So this is the kind of single moment where you see this sort of thing, but anytime you're paving with new roads, parking areas, roofs, that kind of thing, it all has a huge downstream effect on the city in terms of quality of life and removal of biodiversity, but it also means greater flooding hazard, which I'll talk about briefly. And the second part of the project that it was addressing is the loss of public space in the city that took place since the 1990s and continues to take place, as you all know. So how different squares get taken over by sometimes legal, sometimes not legal developments, infill, and all that sort of thing. So this is another picture we took just today. We had this huge rainstorm, and none of that water is getting to those trees. And also, nobody knows how to take care of trees anymore. This is right here in Tatsminda. So the pavement, right, is going right up against the tree trunks. So all of this sealing over of the city is causing a kind of precarity in terms of human life, and not only the social life and ecological life. This is a great document you can download. It was done by Caucasus Environmental Network, and it's hazard of disastrous flooding in the city. And any of you who were here a handful of years ago, I'm going to skip forward to this. You can remember the flood that happened in Vera Ravine. So when you're developing right up against the very, very edge of rivers, you start to create massive hazards, right? Because when you get too much water, you start having these kind of catastrophic floods. So going back to this image here, which you can't really see that well, but since 2001, we've had a huge amount of suburban development up at the higher elevations, as well as in the center of the city. But what this causes is a lot of impact of all that rain coming down onto sealed surfaces, concentrating into these small rivers or heavies, which are not really designed to handle that much water. So we're dealing with conditions right now where we don't have anywhere for that water to go. And this diagram is showing just how if you have the open space and trees, pervious areas, that it can absorb that water. And as you start paving things over, less and less of that water can get in, can infiltrate into the aquifer as well. And so most modern cities have guidelines in terms of development that when you build something that you need to set aside somewhere for that water to go. Otherwise, you'll have to dig up everything and make the drainages bigger, which also isn't necessarily happening. So in this document goes through small river by small river throughout the city and shows all of the areas where you have these kind of pinch points, areas that have been paved over as well as developed. And the hazards that come with it in terms of illegal dumping. And these are all public spaces that we could use in terms of getting places, in terms of greenways, but they're all sort of forgotten, and they're not necessarily thought of. A lot of times the city leaders will think of let's just build one park here, but really this is, our approach looks at building these natural systems and sort of amplifying them to not only deal with the climatic hazards, but also to increase biodiversity. So the second part of Arsenal Oasis is an idea of reclaiming the lost public spaces. As I mentioned, it was developed for the Architecture Biennial in 2020. And we first were looking at the protests that were happening in Vake Park against the privatization, legal privatization of that space. And there is a really strong culture here of protesting against certain things, but then the question is, what do you want, right? So if we don't want them to build a hotel in the park, what do we want? And how can what we do as landscape architects, planners, architects, come together to create the vision of what it is that we want if we don't want them to build another hotel in the park or another set of tower blocks or whatever it is. So this project, we looked at how can we add up all the space that's been lost since 1990 in different neighborhoods and understand what's the total amount of hectares that's been lost or the total number of square meters. And then we looked at in Tbilisi Ubani to look at the former military base site and Arsenal, it's called Arsenal site, and bring all of that lost public space back onto this land. And what would be a strategy to reclaim this space piece by piece? So as you can see in the historic map of the city, there were a number of green spaces that were gardens, public squares, etc. But then the edges of the city are not really delineated as green spaces, which I think continues to be a kind of, black hole in the conception of the city, because we have this noted green space, but then there's just these edge lands, which are forests, which are steppe, plateaus, sometimes more scrublands. And this is an aerial photo of Arsenal when it was barracks, when it was a military base, which it's been for many years. It was then sold, privatized, and all of these barracks were demolished. And this is the condition of it today. And so running down the center line of this large open space, and as you can see, everything around it is super dense. There are no parks whatsoever. There's two drainages on either side, two heavies. This main water line is broken in several places. And you can kind of see that little, maybe not so well in this image, but there's a little green patch there. And so where this water line was broken, a wetland emerged, and it's full of birds and all kinds of different species. And so we saw this as a kind of unsealing or opening up of all of the life that's latent within the city. So if we were just to come in there and start, we just need water and we need to remove the concrete. This is a drone image showing the kind of organization of the site that we picked up on in a way to kind of frame this landscape. And this is basically the condition you would find it today. So if you ever want to visit there, I recommend you going from the top. I'll show you anybody who's interested in, because there's some very scary dogs. So don't go in from the bottom. And all around this area is very full of garbage. It's a wild land. Some people are running cows and sheep on it. But there are these traces of the former military base in the form of these cypress and cedar trees that kind of structure the landscape. So our initial proposal was to frame this leak, this broken pipe, and an idea of when you have these systems that are simple and dedicated towards, providing people with fresh, clean water, one of the ideas that evolved out of this is what if you have a simple, straightforward system, but you're able to take off 2 or 3% of surplus, and can you use that little bit of surplus to create something new, something wild, something wonderful in terms of a garden? So we looked at on the other side of Tatsminda, there is a small wetland in Tbilisi, and here we found the same plant species that were growing all the way out in kind of the wild area in Tbilisi are also growing in Tbilisi Ubani. So all it took was this broken water pipe to make them come to life. So we brought a tractor out to the site. one afternoon and started breaking up the concrete and creating a pool. And then we dug several channels that would then flow that water into an orchard as well. And this impoundment today is also all full of willows and frogs and all kinds of life. And people have brought different types of furniture up there and kind of continue to improvise and edit on this site. And this project for us was also a demonstration of how, as a studio, we were all working, we were drawing things and we were thinking through together on our different projects, but for us it was a chance to actually physically work together and decide how things would move in real life at the real scale together. So for the studio itself, it was a really core way to build a kind of physical intelligence together and also discover what it meant to actually, get something done, to find out who knew how to push a wheelbarrow and who didn't, and who knew how to do what. And so it's really sort of core to our practice. So the other part of Arsenal that I think is fantastic is that you have this platform to view the entire city. You have this wonderful perspective of Tatsminda. You can see all the way to Vake, all the way to Ortichala from this degraded site. So this is how the installation looked on the first day. We had a little bit of water in that main slot that we cut out. We unsealed there, and then we welded these panels. We had these panels welded that would help people to sort of understand how to get across the site and sort of structure the site in a very light way. And we made some pillows so people could hang out. And this broken pipe always made this beautiful spectrum, this rainbow, when it caught the light in a certain way. So in kind of reflection about it, I wrote, engaging with the water was like pulling a loose thread that unraveled the urban fabric and opened new sites of improvisation, adding a third writing of a garden onto the site. Our garden intervention amplified and delineated the existing collective oasis by instigating daily practices and processes of editing, cleaning, rearranging, and constructing, directing flows, and channeling energy. The materials and resources included the source, the durable artifacts of the military installation, walls, foundations, cisterns, the reproductive materials of plants, seeds, stolons, cuttings, and the scattered remnants of the barracks, waste materials. We removed concrete slabs to open more soil, fabricated steel mesh panels to guide visitors through the wetland, and laid concrete pavers that emphasize the remnant structures. So this diagram, which probably isn't very clear because of this projection, but over time, because of the different construction waste that's been dumped there and different animals that are grazing there, the pattern of the water has changed. So every year we come back and a new wetland has developed in a new place. So it's a kind of a wild child in terms of an urban landscape. And this, you can kind of see it pretty well there. So there is a logic to this garden in terms of there's two places where the pipe is broken, one at the top, and then there's a few pools of different depths that we have constructed, and we're both already there. And this model shows this model is showing the area that's like saturated in terms of different species of plants are growing there. So what we see a lot in the city right now is that when new parks are developed, they're sort of also kind of sealed in a very generic, conventional kind of planting with some shapes on the ground and then some plants in different shapes. And it's almost sort of like a frozen picture and very ornamental, more or less. And so this project is a living example of what it means to really work with the living energy of water, of soil, like different levels of soil hydration, and also unfolding ecological practices. And not just like trying to keep those in check and keep them into a consistent picture, but also to have that sort of life be a part of the project as a whole. So this is some pictures on the first day of installation. And also just very simple elements that can structure the site, low cost types of things. I can skip right through this part. We also cataloged all the plants that grow there. It's a super duper variety, lots of color throughout the year. And again, they're all sort of keyed to the different levels of permeability or wetness in the soil. So thinking more about different gradients, I think is really critical in a city like this because we have very, very dry areas, we have super wet areas, and we don't have a ton of resources. So this is the installation of the sycamore pond, we call it. We only lost one tree. Someone just cut it for some reason. We did a lot of planting workshops. A lot of people came by and just pulled the plants out, or we also had a fire. Someone's campfire got out of control. So a large part of it burned in the first year. This drone photo shows the extent of that. But burning is also a part of any landscape, any kind of dynamic landscape. So in the areas that burned, we had different species that came back because some are activated by fire. It also creates this incredible ice sculpture in the winter. And to this day, like Georgian Water and Power has not turned this water supply off. It's great, right? So a few weeks ago, we went and we cut all the willow that had grown and took those cuttings and redistributed them throughout the site into other wet areas. So we come by and we do different activities, and if anyone's interested in doing something there, you should definitely just get in touch. Again, it's just a feral, it's a wild site. Anybody can do anything there. We get frogs now in the pond, which is fantastic. Turtles as well. And we use it, we also use it as a part of our training program. We have interns who come from all over the world every year, and this becomes a sort of outdoor classroom for people. And again, it has this incredible view of the city. And it just shows like how really little you need, if you think about things in terms of systems, what kind of urban landscape and urban ecology you can get. And it's going to be something you haven't really thought of before. I think this is, for us, it was a huge surprise. And when we started thinking about this project, some of the things that we thought were going to be really big ended up really small, and some things that were really small ended up really big. And because when we started, we thought we'd have this big, like, built part, and the water part would be small, but it ended up that the water part was much bigger and the built part was much smaller. So the next project is the Tbilisi Urban Forest, and we have the site plan of the Culley Ridge is in the gallery there. And that project was installed about 2 years ago. There were 2 pilot projects that the city began as part of protecting all of Tatsminda. And they hired us to come up with a way to replant the landscape of Culley Ridge right under Mother of Georgia, as well as the slope in Okrokana, which is where M2 is building a new project, so kind of behind Tatsminda Park. So we worked with a bunch of different scientists who went through at the kind of large scale to divide up the different regions of the mountain in terms of different habitat, different levels of protection, how to integrate trail systems so that people can access the mountain, how to protect it from further development. As we know, like, development is just reaching right up to the very edge of the mountain in many places. so that this can be a resource for everybody in the city, and human and non-human species alike. So our work was to take this very large-scale analysis of the mountain, which is done through GIS, through Geographic Information Systems, and think about what does it look like on the ground. And what we got the list of species from botanists, so anything that was going to be climate adapted for the next 100 years, as well as how we would go about planting where there had originally been plantings of pines. So and I'll show some slides about that in a minute. But we were really concerned what would the effect be like if you were hiking through this forest, and what would it look like from afar? And one of the things that's really critical to any landscape project kind of surviving and being well cared for is that it's legible to people, and that it has a kind of coherence. So we were looking at a lot of Georgian painters and how they depicted landscape, and there was always a kind of idea of these beautiful patches of color, coherent patches of color or texture, and also that in their paintings that was sort of compositions that were stacked up vertically. And these are really critical different ways that we would think about designing a forest than we would, say, in Germany, right? Very specific to cultural ideas of landscape and perception, but also in terms of what species can live here. So this diagram might be a little bit hard to read on the screen, but the colored trees are the new ones. And on both Narikala and Okrokana, Soviet foresters in the last century used dynamite to create pockets for planting pine trees. So if you look at old photos, aerial photos, et cetera, you'll see that there's a kind of grid of trees, and they just went in there and they blew up the mountain, planted the trees in those holes. But when those trees died a handful of years ago, those trees all got cut down, and now we're going in and we're planting inside those pockets a whole variety of species. And I'll show how that works specifically in a minute. But I think this is another idea of like unsealing and creating what we call like a fertile section within an existing condition, or grafting into a baseline condition. So this is the context, Narikala Ridge running down through Solaki. This is a bridge between the botanical garden and the city. And then Okrokana South Slope, you can see it's kind of behind the TV tower. So if you go up into the hills above the city, you'll often see these small terraces that might be remaining, and these were once planted with mostly pine trees, but also this smoke bush, which is Cotinus quagugrea. And, it was like you'd obviously get your picture taken when you were doing this. This is like Soviet Instagram here. They're, big deal. They're still doing this, right? Like, just different faces. So as you climb like Betlemy stairs, if you're here in the city, you can see these pockets, and they have tiny little stone walls around them. So once they cut all of those trees, people were starting to freak out, right? Because this was once a forest. This is about 4 or 5 years ago. If you were here, you remember seeing a lot of these trees. All the pines in the city will die in the next handful of years. Climate change, fungal infection, and also this just things getting drier, and all of the sealed surfaces are all contributing to those pines not surviving. So as I mentioned before, this kind of patchy approach is how we address the sort of coarse scale of the planting. We came up with this kind of subgroups of species and named them different things, like the flowering thicket, the cedar forest, the silver forest, and Tbilisi chaparral. And those planting patches, we call them. So we used, because it's such a huge area, We had to use some scripting. We used Grasshopper for this to do a kind of distribution of the different species within each patch. And not only within each patch there's a distribution, but also within each central tree. So if it's like a acer or maple tree, it would have nurse plants planted around it for cotinous trees. So if you're looking at the trees today, if you go up onto Okakana, you might only see the nurse plants at this point. I'm just going to go back a little bit. So another way that we're working as a result of this project, when we are working in other parts of Georgia, is we have these kind of grids of Soviet pines, and sometimes we'll lose them in an ice storm or some kind of disturbance or a forest fire or disease, and we start to be able to kind of take those out and patch in more diversity and more edge, which in the long run makes for a healthier forest. So this is one strategy we had proposed for the Dendro Park, if any of you have ever been to the one on the sea. That was an approach that was there. It's a little bit hard to see. Anyway, these are the 4 patches and how they were distributed. And basically there are a set of instructions that we gave to the team that was out on the site, because we do have that very specific planting plan that's on the wall, but that's really kind of an ideal, right? And they all had it. They had the small saplings with them, all the different species tagged with the different colors, and then they basically went out with GPS and they found those dynamited locations or found places where there was enough soil to plant these trees. And the software had another important element, which is we didn't know what the supply would be from the nurseries, because the nursery business is not very well developed in Georgia. Most people are importing trees from Italy, from Spain, Turkey. So most of the trees that you see in urban planting projects, these lollipops or these different shapes, or these red bushes or these yellow bushes, those are all coming from abroad. Also notably, that all the shrubs in front of Parliament are imported, right? So these are just generic decorative trees. They have nothing to do with Georgia or the kind of biodiversity and ecological intelligence that's here. So a big part of the work that we're doing as a studio is to introduce people to the trees, the great variety of trees that are around us, that are very well adapted to the conditions and have a really special beauty to them. So at the same time, as we're telling people to please plant these trees, we can't get them. So for Tatsminda's project, there's one large nursery in Kakheti that is completely booked, completely sold out in order to replant Tatsminda. So it's really difficult sometimes for us to think through projects in terms of what plants we want to plant, because we just don't know what's available. So this is something we're kind of hoping to get a flywheel going in terms of desire for endemic species, for local species in projects, and the aesthetics, like the attendant aesthetics, but also to create that supply and good quality supply at that. So with Grasshopper, we were able to adjust. If the nursery said to us, we only have 6,000 acer rather than 8,000, we can then just use the sliders in Grasshopper to slide down the number of acer and maybe increase the number of cedar. And so no one has to sit there and recalculate that themselves. And basically this is what the the technical drawing in terms of the planting would look like. Anyway, this is what it looked like when it was planted in 2022. This forest will start to look really good in about 3 years, I think. I mean, to me, it looks great. It looks beautiful with the models right now. And that was, for me, that was a really important thing about the fashion part of the project, is to capture this moment of the very young trees. That's that moment when the leaves are just coming out and everything's turning a little bit green, a little bit red, which I think is an incredibly beautiful time. So those are our two projects that we're sharing today.
Hello, thanks very much, Sarah, for asking me, and Ubani. It's wonderful. I've only been here 24 hours, my first visit to Tbilisi, so excuse my naivety, but I've had I think already quite incisive visit, and part of it today we went up to photograph these two tree scenarios, which I think is useful. Actually, we should go to the second one first.
This guy.
Yeah. So I just wrote down a few notes while you were talking, and some words. So you said unsealing. I think it's also releasing, loosening, remediating, and so it was funny because we took the first image first, and that's a sort of slightly grey area version, isn't it? Because the tree isn't locked in exactly, but it kind of is. So this is the obvious one where the diagram is that it's trapped, totally trapped, isn't it? And so what you're talking about is releasing and allowing breath. I think if we go back then to the first one, so this one is poking up, isn't it, through the hole in the platform, but it's also trapped. But it's a more grey area one. And this morning I walked down from Freedom Square and found, this city that's underneath, but it's really like that. So we've been responsible to recognize we need to preserve this earlier moment, but the way that it's reconciled is not anywhere near where it needs to be. So I think that's quite a useful analogy. So I think you're talking about releasing the city ecologically in terms of vegetation, but probably in a much broader way too. It's allowing all sorts of aspects maybe to breathe. And so I don't know, does that sort of resonate with you? I suppose I'm talking about cultural histories as well as vegetative ecologies. And in a city like this, which has got so many moments, vegetative and cultural and natural histories, I think maybe that's metaphoric, that first image.
Yeah, and then I think it's, there's a scaling up that we like to think about. It, not only is there, not enough water is getting to the roots of those trees, but also these rivers that, are flowing into Ubani River are sealed. And this, in this diagram from CNN, the red is where the rivers are covered over. And a lot of studies have been shown that in cities, wherever they've built on top of a river, those buildings are the first ones to start to decompose because of the moisture, because of that sort of natural depression and moisture that's collecting there. So Philadelphia, there's an amazing studies about, entire neighborhoods would just collapse because they had covered over the river. So not only are these pinch points for when there's heavy rains, and we could see this in the next couple of days, to be honest, a kind of catastrophic flood, because we're seeing that there's, between 10 and 15 millimeters is going to be raining in the next couple of storms, and that can kind of sometimes ramp up. And there's just not enough room. And Gigi's also been sharing a lot of Kidze's been sharing photos of these places in the city where large valleys just taper down into tiny, tiny pipes. And again, this is energy that needs to go somewhere, right? Energy that needs to get released, but it's all trapped right now. It's not really, it's serving the city in that we're able to pave, roads over it and build housing over it and build buildings, but we're also losing quite a bit of the ecological intelligence and energy that is, what makes the city a great place to be.
I was also thinking, obviously, the manifestations and the notion of change is everything you're talking about, or maybe quite severe change or radical change, fundamental change, and how that rarely, I think, comes smoothly. And maybe, so the actual form of the transition. So in Arsenal, you're bringing an aggressive device to break up the concrete. Then presumably there's toxicity issues. And yesterday we were walking around looking at all these incredible buildings, and the paint that's peeling is obviously toxic, it's lead. And so the metamorphosis is not, it's beautiful, it's sublime, if you like, but it's also highly problematic, isn't it, in many ways? Mm-hmm. And it can be aggressive, and it can be frightening, but it must happen. And I wondered, you know, how do you feel, or how do you manage that, or how do you feel as you're going into something that you know necessarily is in some way aggressive?
It's a great question.
There's high impact, isn't there, you're being brave, but you're also being somewhat probably cavalier, and then you're also probably being naive in some ways. Mm-hmm. And I think all those are key for significant change. And it's very exciting. You know, sometimes the toxicity in the river looks sublime, doesn't it? You get extraordinary colors, but we know there's something, you know, really sinister, but we need to push through that period. So the concrete itself is releasing, when you break it up, it's releasing something, isn't it? And sometimes, you know, I'm aware of landscapes, they just cap the whole thing because they know to try and remediate by pulling it up releases so much gas. They just don't want to go there, or the landfill is capped. But you're not doing that. You're saying, no, we're going there.
We're going there and we're creating something new by, you know, all, like, the very positive energy that's in there, as well as the, you know, whether it's toxic history or it's actual toxic materials, all of that is creating different culture. And I think we're in that. We're just in a point right now where, like, we haven't seen yet the culture that is going to carry us through this, you know, maybe it's this month or these years. But I feel like there's something to the practice that you practice and I practice and others, is that we're really trying to unseal that. Unseal what are the ways that we're going to use the tools and skills of our various disciplines, cross-disciplines, et cetera, to create a new kind of culture in the city, or new ways of interacting with, you know, those unsealed spaces and those sealed spaces, and how we come together to do that, you know, with everything that's getting kicked up at the same time, right? The lead and the anger.
We call it the red flag territories, don't we?
Yes.
So I think we have this discussion a lot. Yeah. That sometimes people tell you, oh, the red flag means stay away, but we don't feel that. I think we feel the red flag is useful because it tells us we need to be more prepared, more aware, maybe more collaborative, but we never run off, do we? But I think maybe sometimes we've got into the water too quickly, but I think it's about finding the right network to go in, because you can't ignore these red flag zones. That's how I feel. Then you can't just live for the pretty piece up the mountain that's functional. It's the sort of dysfunctional where the future lies, I think, isn't it? So that's where the future that we can survive this the right way.
And that's, you know, and that's how we thought about the planting with Arsenal. The planting is self-organizing. It just happens to be what's in the seed bank, in that soil, and all you have to do is add water or fire, or the birds are picking, you know, eating the berries and pooping them and landing there, or the seeds are coming in the air. So it's, you know, this is an idea of a kind of latency that's not, you know, it doesn't yet have the switch turned on for it to then self-organize into something else. With Narikala, it's very different. It's very purposeful. We're planting this tree here, we're planting that tree there, but each of those trees gets a helper. So that idea is, that was developed by Stephen Handel, a ecologist, and it's an idea of nucleation, where if you plant intensely in certain patches, the birds are going to land there, they're going to eat the berries, then they're going to fly over to the next place and, you know, poop out those berries. Or they're going to, you know, it'll slowly start to leapfrog and create what maybe is also called a wander biotope. And so it's another kind of economical way of thinking about how to re-engage with this intelligence, ecological intelligence in your city. So it is, again, it's about kind of like setting up the teamwork, whether it's knowing that there's a way that this ecosystem will self-organize and doing your homework around it, or also being really intentional about what you plant there.
So at the beginning, you mentioned possibly architects may look at the city in different ways to landscape architects. And maybe I am an architect. I work with landscape architects and landscapes a lot, but I am an architect. I think we're always looking for how we overlap, but why also there are sometimes tensions. And I think maybe the issue of time in a project is typically quite different for the work of an architect and the work of a landscape architect, maybe the kind of outcome or product. So this building is an exception maybe because we're seeing this as a temporal condition. We're in it at a moment of change, but I think you can see the attitude towards the building is unusual. It's not typical for how we might see other buildings in this city or in London. It's breaking the rules because it's in progress. Typically, I think the architect is looking to get their photographs of their output fast before the client maybe comes in and wrecks the vision. And so it means there's something very, and this is, there are exceptions, but in that, if we want to sort of typify fundamental differences maybe in these practices, there definitely is a scenario where the architecture product is finite in terms of photographing it, the portfolio piece, the evidence. Go in there quickly, we want it to look perfect. We might add some people, but only in the terms that we want to see them. So sometimes architects are also urbanists. Meanwhile, in the landscape projects, one that I've worked on, I'm getting ready to go and photograph it now, and it's actually 20 years later, because I think it's going to really be in a position that we can judge it, if you like. So then, if landscape is operating on a temporal basis, if let's say, or the critical practice maybe of landscape, because you're the evidence of critical practice, I think, then you're not looking at this moment that comes when the contractor leaves, I'm guessing, and both of those projects tell us that already. So then I think it's quite fascinating if you put an architect as an urbanist, let's say the stereotypical architect who's imagining a finite moment when the contractors leave, perhaps, or a landscape architect as an urbanist who probably isn't thinking that way. So I'm just expanding maybe what you mentioned at the beginning. And I think, a lot of the work maybe already explains that, but how do you respond?
Sometimes it's in how we represent a project. Like if you'll see a render of any project in this city. The trees are, mature. They're 10, 20 years old. They're 5 meters tall, right? Which means you have to go get that tree from somewhere, and then you plug it into a hole, just like you did in Photoshop. You just drag it over, or in Lumion, or whatever you're doing, right? And it is like a tree, right? But it's not really functioning as part of an ecosystem. Or maybe the architect calls us and goes, what trees do I need on my facade? And then we say, well, you have to, and they don't want to know, right? Because they just want to Photoshop their way out of it. And it's, the trees don't want to necessarily be up there, but we'll put them up there. But that is always a bit of a struggle, right? How many times have I worked with an architect who'd said, can you just move the tree a little bit away from the facade in this render, right? But I think we are in an era where there is a little more understanding between the two of us about, what does it mean to have these permeable spaces in the city and find these fertile sections, to find these places where water can collect, where we can have more life, where we can actually have, plant systems rather than plants as objects. And I think there was somebody, I think it was Michael van Valkenburg said, like, a building will never look better than the first day that it's opened and a landscape will never look worse. But I kind of want to challenge that and say, I think this moment when we first plant these seedlings, when everything is super green, like literally like young and green, is an incredible time, because we get to, if we can photograph that like Barry did, we can see this beginning, we can see this unfolding, and it gives us something really wonderful to look at in 5-10 years, right? We can see how things have changed around us, and they serve as a really wonderful play against architecture, with architecture kind of being the straight man, and the landscape unfolding, dying, growing, changing all around.
Yeah, but I mean, also I'd like, again, the evidence here of the exception in architecture too. I think it's essential to not also think of architecture in that way. It's never going to look as good as the day. I mean, what a fiasco.
Right.
If it's only going to be good before it's being used for the purpose it was. So I think we both feel to challenge the stereotype. And because this has got such richness as a result of breaking that regulation, I think. Anyway, the last thing I was just going to ask, which leads on from that, is this thing about digital technology that you just mentioned again. And it seems like the ability for new technologies in software, the parametric modeling, also takes you back to maybe some kind of low tech, actually, in terms of the interventions. Because I find that really fascinating. It's almost like the very, very sophisticated software is a portal back to some much more simple approach to vegetation that doesn't rely on taste or contorted systems in a way. It seems like the systems that come out of it are actually quite simplified. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because you're able to feel the basics, which are drainage and soils and climate and wind. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, when Ben developed the script for the planting, he said, I mean, we can specify where everything's going to go, but it comes down to some guys digging holes. And so we want them to have general set of instructions of, what goes where and how to stake out the area. But we're just getting a shopping list from it, and we're getting general zones. We can make an incredibly rich render also out of that scripting that is like a version of what this thing might look like a probable version, which I think is fantastic, because we kind of have two, we have real world parametric modeling that's going on with this project. So
it's interesting. It's kind of analog and very, very sophisticated digital, isn't it?
One-to-one.
Yeah, one-to-one.
Sweet.
Okay, so I think we've got about 10 minutes. If anybody'd like to ask Sarah questions, I can pass you my mic. Anyone? Oh, thank you.
Okay. Okay, let's just start with me. Thank you, first of all, for this interesting talk. And I just want to say how this theme of landscape and planting and trees can exaggerate to more general things that Peter brought up. And especially in this moment of time in our city, I would like to talk about bottom-up initiatives dealing with the threats that we are facing, and especially that frightening notion that you said about losing all that greenery on the slopes around the city, about that all that pine trees are eventually going to die. So, and it's quite important and triggering that no one really talks about that and no one is maybe aware. So is it possible, it's such an interesting and important project of this Tbilisi Urban Forest, of this replanting the slopes, but as I understand it didn't go on, the project, by the City Hall. So is there a way, like, to talk about bottom-up initiatives, about bottom-up activism, to work on that without relying on some state institutions to support that? And is there a way for, like, us, society and all the individuals to do that without that support?
Yeah. That is a really great question. There are, a handful of initiatives right now, like those of you who have heard of Napirze in Rustavi, which is a bottom-up initiative to replant the floodplain, which is led by Data Sinsadze. That project, that takes 1, 2, 3 people who work on it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, getting grants, digging the holes, organizing people to do the planting, and they're completely dedicated to it. And it can't be done as like, we do one planting one day, right? Like, it's tree planting, because it takes maintenance, because it takes setting up irrigation, and then making sure when that irrigation breaks, that you go and fix it. So I think that there's so many mechanisms where the bottom up and the organization and the stewardship and the care can work, but sometimes it short circuits into, we just did a planting, we planted some trees, and then you go back and you see, like, in the next year they've all died, because there's not enough institutional or financial backing behind it to keep it alive, right? Or it's, landscape's just really expensive, and people can't resell it. Like, they can't necessarily sell the experience of that tree to somebody. It's not by the square meter that they can rent it out. So, these are the complicated economics that we deal with, is to, we try to say, well, it's, landscape ecosystem services, or it's nature-based solutions, or it's a carbon credit, or this is going to help, comply with future regulations, or whatever it is. But it's a really complex mosaic to get it done. And, I think the more that we organize together, we advocate for these things, but sometimes it comes down to just like one guy who really gets it done, or one woman. In many cases, it's it's somebody who's marshaling those resources, identifying the problem, marshaling the resources, getting the grants, and then doing the work of tending a garden. That's really what it takes. And it would take, the city having an attitude towards the peripheral spaces, the same that it takes towards, say, greening just before an election.
I've come to think that model is probably exactly it. It's the sort of future, really. Because, and it's not just for Georgia. I think the idea that we wait for our governments to be sophisticated enough to identify what the issue actually is, apart from then being able to be responsible, funded, organized, interested to follow it through, is totally naive. And I think I work on a project in Richmond, in Virginia, in the USA, and it's totally the model you said. It's not, the city is not asking for this. It's a group of people. In fact, it started really with just trying to do a sort of pretty landscape bridge. And then the more we went into it, we started to uncover the extraordinary cultural histories, travesties really, that had occurred throughout that city and created all sorts of sinister, toxic, culturally toxic issues, as well as natural history, travesties too. And there's absolutely no way the city could look at itself that way. It will never be able to. And so we've progressed to realizing that's also okay. But it does mean that this grant process, for example, is essential, not just because it can provide the funding maybe to do the research and to get the team to go, but because it gives the project a kind of, it creates a reality for the project it makes it sincere, it means that it's been given it's kind of authenticated, if you like, by a broader body. So we're just going through that with organizations in the US like Mellon Foundation and Ford Foundation. And I think that then you can come back to the city, probably. If you've gone beyond it, you can come back. And the other thing it does is it defines who the community actually is. Because one of these that I've been involved in so many times, is you have a client, maybe it's the city, and they identify they want to do something or other. Maybe it's this project with the trees. And then at some point, once it's already some way down the line, then we have to do our public consultation. But how do we know who the community really was? Because we're just going there as a group of kind of aliens, who are architects anyway, and then the community is going to sit where you are now, and we'll present our wonderful ideas. So, and then we arrive thinking, well, I hope we don't have to give up this or that, and then we leave thinking, oh, we did have to give up that one, but we managed to keep this one. And there's nothing to do with the reality of what we should be doing. Should be that at the beginning, the community organize itself in the sort of grassroots way. So then the community's right there. It's not having to be consulted, it's generating the project. And that just seems to me so sort of obvious when you come to it that way around, but it's quite rare. But I think there are precedents around the world for where that works. And I truly believe that the outcome then is going to be something which is embedded and will evolve and just get better. Because the alternative where maybe the city decides, oh, we need this thing over here, like we need a bridge, for example, because that's going to make everything better. And we did all our public consultation with the community who are on the sort of receiving end of this idea and say, oh, yeah, I prefer if it was blue, maybe, and then we all decide we'll do purple. Then probably 10 years later, it's going to turn out we didn't even need that bridge. It was something else fundamental that we never even scratched the surface of, because you're putting people on the receiving end instead of the driving force. And I think that is the way. It's sort of silly to think that a city, a government who's got to worry about cleaning the streets and taxes and so many other things could be able to see outside of themselves and do that. So I'm totally committed, and also then that the structure of the team is horizontal, not with a client and an architect, and then this pyramid of consultants, and the consultants are too frightened to tell the architect what they really thought, and the public consultees are a bit too frightened because they don't even really understand what was happening. And then the client's got his own pyramid like that, and there are people up there that are too frightened to tell the boss of the client what they wanted. I think those initiatives just have to be like that. And together you work out who you want to fund the project, and you work out where that money needs to go in the team. I think it's that's what I'm totally committed to trying to work out. And I think it will be, the energy around that project is extraordinary, I think, at that point. And the city will just probably say, okay, great, we maybe match fund you because you're so set up and you've taken all this work off our plate. Mm-hmm. And also, even if they don't, it will be thundering towards them that they can't, it would be a PR disaster to say no. I think that's it. But it does have to have a really sophisticated team, and then I think that recognition of the grant to give it that kind of kudos, because you have to bring that back to all the people that say, oh, you can't do that though here, you can't do that, you'll never be able to do that for us, there isn't the money. And I think you have to come back and say, no, we are, and then you have to get the corporate giants of the city to realize that's good for their PR, their community outreach program, and they will start supporting. And then how can the city say no? Because it's already funded itself. And I do have some examples of where trusts are formed in projects where for years nothing could happen. It's just all a stalemate because they're all conflicted stakeholders, and you put everybody together as one trust, and then they're on the same side. There's no enemy, if you like. I think that's just, it seems so straightforward. It's just that it's not the conventional route to procuring projects now. I think it was, hundreds of years ago. That's how communities would organize themselves to do things. It's just that we've gone through all these sort of formal steps that means that we're sort of waiting for someone else to help. But it wasn't the traditional way. It's very abstract, in fact, that approach.
And how does that, for us, I mean, this inflects our practice. Like, we are, we're working with as many, bottom-up, community-led groups as possible because they're also teaching us about what this discipline of landscape can do. How can we, continually support them by drawing the project in a way that helps them communicate it to people to get more momentum, right? Our disciplines can do this. We have this incredible power to make those visualizations, to bring that utopia to social media, to, some video or something, to do that pilot planting project, to manifest it. And those are the projects, this is why, we do the other projects, right? Because, we want to be involved in community and we want to be involved in these bottom-up projects, bringing, momentum and expertise and listening, right? Because again, we get to learn more about what it is that we do and how to do it better by working with the people who have have that strong stake in defending and protecting and building what they want in terms of the future of the ecology, of the landscape, of the social spaces. So that's the best part of this job that I've learned how to do. And the opportunity to work with other like-minded designers, architects, culture makers, right? And that we can come together to make this thing happen because, city might do it, but we need to serve it up on a beautiful plate for them.
Well, it is activism, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think, which is a great word. Active, great. But I think, again, realizing that doesn't all look straightforward. It's not linear. It doesn't look pretty. This is what we all know about change. And then being braced for that.
Braced.
Yeah, like brace. Yeah. Anybody else?
Maybe some questions? Okay, yeah. Regarding that Tbilisi Urban Forest, I come from a totally different field, so it looks like a pretty complex biodiversity restoration project to me. And so, what apart from artistic references you mentioned with patches of color and etc., are there any actual, real, natural references? I don't know, from around the Culley forest, or what exactly did you use for that?
Yeah.
And the second question, and what would be what was the degree of copying, the actual degree of copying the natural thing while restoring? Yeah,
we do a lot of work. We're out in the field as much as we can in different regions of Georgia, and we're taking photographs, we're drawing, we're inventorying species, and we're under what we call a kind of reference site in ecology. So we look at, where is it, like Tbilisi wetland, for example. There's a community of plants that have evolved there, and there's also cultural traces. So if, a landscape was, primarily structured for agriculture initially, or it was structured with some decorative plants for, some kind of installation that was there, as well as basically the kind of background plants, the sort of natural endemic species. We're always looking at that mix of agricultural, endemic, and cultural species together. So we make notes, sketches, we have, huge photo library. And then we're also working with the ecologists, botanists, et cetera, and they're going to tell us, like, okay, in these soil conditions, you can grow these certain species, or in the next 20 years, this species is going to drop out, but this one is going to come in. So together, and if you look at the paintings by Georgian painters, they're delineating all those different activities that are happening within the different landscapes in terms of where are the houses, where are the trees lined up in an LA, what are the different textures of the different agricultural plots, and then how do the different patches of natural vegetation, collect themselves onto the, side that gets more rain or the side that gets more sun. So it's all, like, all those Georgian painters have done it really scientifically, artistically as well. So we're looking at both of those things, just getting out into the forest, getting out into the meadows. And a lot of what we're doing is we're teaching architecture students who, have a more straightforward, like, formal education in architecture and urbanism, but then giving them that piece of understanding of ecology, plant communities, climate change, cultural history as well. Because that's the thing we don't want to lose is, how were people planting trees, even if they aren't Georgian species, for example, but they are planting a certain rose in their garden, or they're planting a certain, fruit tree, or grape, or cedar tree, etc. These kind of iconic, trees that we see in the city. Those are also really critical to keep in the mix.
You're also in the landscape all the time, aren't you? You personally.
Yes.
I think that's something that's probably very intuitive too. On top of all that, I would think that you're immersed and observing. It's sort of like hyper observation, isn't it? So I suspect there's a system, and then there's also an intuitive decision making, subliminal almost.
Learn the names of the trees. They know your name. Trust me. You learn their names. Then you go out there and you'll start saying, oh, there's the cedar, or like there's like hurma, or there's, elm tree. And then, oh, there's more elm trees over here. There's more willow trees gathering. And you'll start to see those patterns, and you go, oh, this thing is blooming at this time of year. This thing is blooming at that time of year. This thing didn't lose its leaves. This thing did. And the world becomes really rich, and starts to give you some great reasons to go out there. I mean, for me, it's sometimes, oh, I'm depressed, I don't want to go out. And I think, oh, but maybe there'll be orchids today, right? So I go out there. And I go find those orchids. Maybe they're blooming, or maybe poppies are blooming. Maybe something new is happening. And that motivates me so much. And that's another reason I love living here, because it's always changing and it's so rich.
Thank you. Any questions?
I wanted to ask if there were other planting initiatives that you guys are working on. One that comes to mind is green roofing. Maybe in Tbilisi, that's too much of a stretch because it's old buildings, but in Sabortalo or Vake, maybe it's possible.
It's possible. It's possible anywhere.
I don't know, but these buildings, I don't think so. I think the roof will come crashing down.
Yeah.
I think it's what it is, isn't it? There's all sorts of motivations for the green roof. Sometimes it's maybe just about avoiding heat buildup for the building, and so you can do very sort of thin systems that are somewhat porous, but they're just avoiding the classic thing of the roof absorbing all the sun. So it can be thin. Then it can be, oh, we're deciding that we need to put that forest all up there on the roof. And then that's something much more significant, or we need to have a serious amount of water on the roof. So I think, like usual, it's sort of setting the aim, setting the parameter is we feel we can't allow maybe this level of porous blank roof. So then if you set that parameter, then you try and I guess you'd be quite forensic to work out what you can and can't do in the individual situation. So, as usual, I think it's just degrees. But if there is a decision, I mean, it's more difficult if it's pitched roofs, of course. But there's lots of examples of older buildings that the roof is utilized, is utilized for human access, and that means it's got to withstand movement. But we've seen this sort of air rights thing in even where Sarah lives. There's a building built over a much older building, so it doesn't have to be a building, but you could find a way, I guess, to make structures that straddle. It seems like this city does do that, and some cities seem very good at leapfrogging to sort of avoid some of the issues. But I mean, aside of that, maybe in terms of this thing of how far do you go, like there's an interesting debate about trees or not, isn't there? So maybe, you know, the thinnest thing is that classic sedum roof where you hardly have any soil and the plants themselves survive on very little, and also they don't need a lot of water, so it's very, very light. And it's lightweight and light, you know, it's LITE in a sense, isn't it? And then on the other extreme is trees that are supposed to grow to maturity. And you have a sort of a feeling about that too, don't you? The sort of critical position on big trees. Do you see what I mean? It's a very different set of requirements and aspirations. You know, the term green roof is quite generic, but the reality is a big variation. But yeah, just about the idea of providing the right conditions for trees to grow. What do you feel about that on a roof?
And it's not always, sometimes it doesn't have to be the roof to get the effect, which I think Peter was making the point about that, because, you know, green roof, great idea, but like for why? Like why? Right? Do we want it cool? Do we want to intercept? Do we want to unseal again?
Do we want to capture water?
Do we want to capture water? Do we want to make a really freaking great space, right? So maybe we do want to take 8-meter trees with big root balls, and we're going to put them right on the columns. You know, we're going to design this building to hold up trees. We're really going to do this, right? And we're going to guide those trees down you're going to do all the amazing technical work that we need to do to make that space and put those trees on the roof. Or, you know, maybe we just don't do the parking the same way, right? Like maybe we create more soil depth in the areas around the building so that we can have that infiltration, that, you know, some kind of a cistern system. Maybe we don't, pave everything around it so that we can get that kind of balance back. There's all these ways that we can intervene or sort of, you know, carefully go in to areas where we've just kind of been a little sloppy with our dimensions and claim that back, right? Claim and unseal those areas and put some pipes in, right, so that it drains properly. All that.
Yeah, and it could be that we say, well, we can't put the green roof here, but we can capture all the water from that roof and divert it here where maybe we can do a green roof or we can do a garden. And so I think it's about realizing it can't be dumb anymore. None of the individual situations can be dumb. Maybe it can't do everything, but once you start to look at a wider system, nothing needs to be dumb like that, you know, or only just doing its one simple job.
Right, just like the water arsenal, right? That was just a water main feeding, you know, drinking water to everybody. But what if we just take a little bit of that water, just a little bit?
Yeah.
We can create a whole, you know, parkland out of it. We could create a whole new wetland system of plants that couldn't survive there otherwise. So I think this idea of like, well, we have, you know, maybe we get a little bit smarter and a little more efficient and a little less sloppy with dimension, and we start to find those places where we can be really brilliant.
Yeah, be opportunistic. I like looking at buildings and thinking of them as opportunities for doing something that we didn't necessarily thought they were. That, okay, they house people, but maybe they do all these other things primarily and happen to house people in them as well. I mean, you can start to think of it that way round, that it works within the city system, providing all sorts of infrastructural needs, and on top of that, we've carved into it 20 housing units. You know, do you see what I mean? If you start to think of it that way around, I think you then can look at older buildings, you know, and think of them opportunistically too. But it just means you're not applying one classic green roof system onto everything, I think. But I think it's a good question.
Well, I want to respond really quickly. So first, trees are great, but I'm thinking grass, like simple grass and soil. Like forget the trees for a second, just put the grass on the roofs.
Yeah, well, the sedum is even more simply that, because you don't have to cut it or do anything, yeah.
And I mean, the second thing would be like, community engagement is great, but synergies with construction companies and developers is, I think, more attainable. Like, talk to people who work in construction, talk to people who are developing the buildings, because they know what that building can withstand. I mean, we can think about, you know, green utopias, but if the building can't hold it, it can't hold it. And then the second thing is like, well, the third thing is the grass will absorb the water. Like it's not just for, to be pretty or whatever, but it will absorb that runoff. And then you could also divert that extra water because it won't absorb everything, but
we could also take a very diverse mix of flowers, forbs, wildflowers, all different kinds of species. So yes, grass, we can throw that seed down there, but what if we're just as cheap and we have a whole diverse kind of meadow, which then is going to attract different bugs, which is then going to attract different birds, right? So of course, grass, whatever. But keep thinking, right? Like, keep thinking through, like, what are the possibilities that afford us by just making something a little bit permeable versus impermeable? And I think we can start to see a city evolve in a really interesting and different way.
There is another question.
Thank you guys for an amazing lecture.
Thank you.
I had a question about Tbilisi itself as regarding the streets more, because we talked about big projects, which are actually Nargala and the other sides, and these are more forests and big spaces. I mean, regarding you can do the forest actually there. And what do you think about greening? I'm interested in the opinion of Tbilisi is super small. It's not like the big cities where you have big ground in front of the house where, for example, my father and I planted like oak trees, and they're almost like 4 floors up, and it's beautiful. But in Tbilisi there is no space because the streets are super small. And also there is another thing that Tbilisi is super old, and for example some roots of big trees are making problems for the construction, etc., etc. So I wonder, just this theme of the question is, what do you think of greening the small streets in Tbilisi? Because it's also the problem of the air and all this thing. Because the forest is, I totally agree, and I will plant.
That's like a bulk approach.
Yeah, this is a different thing. But what about
the question,
Tbilisi streets itself? They're super small.
They're super small. And then we have big boulevards, right? There's lots of approaches to making those streets more permeable, bringing some biodiversity into those streets. And I recently saw some pictures of these stone streets, these cobblestone streets that are in the US, where on these old streets in Tbilisi, even these steep ones, right? Those are permeable, those cobblestone streets, right? The water can actually sink down through there. So you could have an approach of, re-engineering those streets to be cisterns, right? To hold water, slow it down. I mean, it's all in terms of an imagination about engineering. And then on the larger streets, you can tear up the sidewalk and you can put in these kind of different cells. They're called silicells. That also allow those trees to have their roots to go in certain places and not get snarled up into the infrastructure. They're expensive, right? These are very difficult projects to get done, but you can also just replace the one tree that somebody cut down on your street and widen the tree pit around it, right? That's like a simple gesture. There's 4 trees on my street that have been cut down over time or weren't pruned well and are really sick. So, I would really look at these old cobblestone streets as a kind of prototype, and that might be something interesting, students or something, to look at how can we make those old streets really the smartest streets in the city. That would be something exciting to look at.
But also you can't. Can you see this? What do you call that?
Ezo.
Okay, so you have this wonderful scenario that narrow streets and then really big, relatively, really large kind of negative space. I don't mean that.
Yeah.
it's a break in the street, and it's visible from the street. It's not a courtyard or a backyard. It's like a sort of I don't know what that means exactly. It's not that common to me. I mean, there's a lot of side gardens as well, so they're visible from the street with railings. So that's beautiful. It means they're sort of available to us. But what I was just holding up was what. So Sarah and I do this when we walk around. I think we're quite sort of. Somehow in a past life or an earlier part of this life, we were doing similar nerdy things. So we will stand, like where I had that picture, is looking across at a break in the street, and the street is here, and the buildings go around like that in a, sort of muddly way. And there's this really potentially beautiful space. So we were looking at one, and I said, but they just got to take up the asphalt. And it was before I knew that Sarah's talk is, about pulling up the asphalt. And so I think we both travel through looking at, and then immediately we see what that looks like. It's like putting on those glasses or the before and after picture. We know what that space is like as soon as the asphalt is pulled up and Sarah gets to work with these projects. So I think because you asked specifically about Tbilisi, that's a wonderful typology that you have here. And of course, there's always pressure to fill in those spaces, but somehow they've survived regularly. I mean, everywhere I walk, that happens here, and I'm not used to that. In New York, you have those little pocket parks, which are a different relationship to the fabric, but they maybe have some kind of synergy. But I'm not used to that in most British scenarios. Or in a lot of Europe, you might have a formal plaza that could be bigger or smaller. But these are really intimate. They're private, but we have the benefit of them. We have the benefit visually, and then in terms of the, say, pollution or ecological benefit. The leaves are falling and cleaning things for us. So I would say maybe in terms of planning, you would try and latch onto that as an exemplar that is specific to this city and resist. It's back to this resistance again of filling those in. And maybe if there are new developments made, you would plan for those spaces to exist in clusters around. So I think then you can have very dense the streets and building right onto the street, like you were saying today, no setback. Because you're doing you're sort of making up for that setback in a really beautiful, sort of semi-private way. And then it just seemed like some of the ones that exist now, Sarah needs to go and open them up, loosen them up so that they can be much more.
And connect all the drain pipes.
Pardon?
We connect all the drain pipes.
Yeah, we can use all those roofs that the person there mentioned to help make sure they grow really well. And I think there are all sorts of benefits in terms of the summer when you have spaces like that, in terms of how the city is ventilated. They're like sort of release valve moments. So I think it actually is beautifully there. A lot of cities don't have that component, I think. And maybe that's why it's there, partly because it just would be too much without it. It's too relentless without that.
One more question.
It's in the Ezo.
Hi. Thank you very much for the lecture and for inspirational speech. And actually everything that you are doing, because for me it's very kind of way to think when I look at your work, because it's also like very artistic approach to the things, like to take something that is not visible at all and not important to anyone and make it really important for the city and for the public and for everybody. And I think what you did on Arsenal Forest is a great example how we can use our surroundings of the city, and it's it's even not the surrounding. It's in the city. It's a great place to walk and like go for a walk with the kids or so on and so on. And well, it's not a question. I just wanted to say thank you because it is a way that I really wish to have a chance to work, or wish all the architects to think that way.
Yeah,
So thank
I
you
think
very
we
much.
we are all going to be working together to,
Yeah.
every project we try to get some piece of that in there and manifest it, and then it starts to work, right? Like, if we just said for each some developer wants to build, 20-story building, okay, then let's put one tree in every ezo. If they can't give us back that piece of land they're taking out, right? Like, can there be some kind of mechanism, legal mechanism? That's crazy, right? But a lot of places do it. And you mentioned that today, right? With the Battersea.
Yeah. We in the UK, it's a formalised process, which is called a planning gain, a Section 106. So I don't know if people know Battersea Power Station. It's the big, huge 4 chimneys that are opposite the very dainty Chelsea side of the river. And at one moment in Industrial Park, there was this huge power station blowing out huge amounts of black, toxic stuff out of 4 chimneys. Anyway, finally, I think it went through several developers, but in order to get all the permissions, the developer had to extend the underground line in return for the permission to do the work. So they had to extend the underground line by a whole station, build a new station, have public art in the station, and so the developer, that's what they need to do. They can afford to do it. But if they weren't required to do it, of course, they're not going to build a new underground station. However, it's great value added to their development. But I think that was a very clever part of the planning system that was, and lots of times the developers get around it. Like, most often it is a park. They have to build a park in return for the permission to build the, however many luxury apartments. And there are lots of examples where they build the park in such a way that the public can't really get into it. But I think now the planners have got much better at being on top of that deal. But yeah, I mean, that's a really, really clever one. It exists in the US too. And it's how all sorts of public benefits have got out. It's a way of taxing the developer in a way that the developer in the end doesn't mind that much, because it is an added value piece to the development as well. And I like the idea of trying to find a developer that just starts off thinking that way. So you're coming to the city already with a bigger expectation than they're asking for, because really, as the developer, that's going to make your project way better, more of an exemplar, much higher reputation, better PR. I think if you just learn those systems and start off that way, then it's kind of a win-win. But it does require the fallback of the permission resting on it, I think. It's the Central Park sort of model, isn't it? If you don't build that, all the value is around the edge, whereas if you built on it, none of that would have that value. There's something quite straightforward about it.
Trades.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
So my question regards to the river, which is flowing in the middle of the city, which is kind of not the part of the town, and also the part of it. And it's like very strictly in the confined, and it's not part of the public life. So it's more like a city council prerogative, probably, but some cities try to include the river in the cities and be more green. Not to have such a big negative space like we have in Tbilisi, because it's like there's only roads running through this river. So do you think that you will try to talk to city council to try to make it more accessible to and more green? To create more green spaces to this and solve this problem, because they can make underground tunnels and on top kind of green spaces. If you get
I mean,
what
yeah,
I'm saying.
there's so many examples worldwide where cities have done that. They've capped the highway. But this is, this again has to come from everybody, right? So, on Instagram, whatever, just keep posting pictures of it, right? Just keep that vision, wherever you find those examples, or maybe, together you guys Photoshop something. We can obviously, try to propose that, but what are, for us, we're a private company that gets commissions here and there. And it has to come, again, what Peter was saying, this has to come from the citizens. This has to come, it is a desire that I think everybody in the city probably shares. Probably nobody wants, to be divided from the river by like 8 lanes of traffic, very fast traffic, and come to a river that's not clean, right? But how do we move the needle? How do we get there? How do we get that river cleaned all the way from the border of Turkey to here? And there are people working on this. It's a very slow process, but I mean, I think at some time fairly soon they will probably create a deck over the river.
It's also quite good to map the power players, I think in the city, because sometimes you're surprised how they sit, in relation to some of the problem areas, because you think, oh, maybe they would be in there, somehow organize themselves in areas where the issues aren't kind of in their face. But quite often, if you really map who the players in the city are, and so that could be the power players, the corporations with assets, but it's also the communities who need to be served. If you sort of map all of the different organizations and individuals who have a vested interest, quite often people with some kind of power, whether it's financial or political, you can find them in the problem zones. So not the city. Again, if we're saying we can't rely on the city necessarily, but I think that's a really good exercise to see who lies right there where you're saying change needs to happen, because they may find it quite exciting if an organization, the grassroots organization, starts to propose something that is going to maybe benefit the environment of their workers, but also, as I said, be really good for their kind of outreach or corporate identity. I think you have to be a little cynical as well around it, understand how they need to work, because if you get some power players behind an initiative, the city will definitely listen to that, because the city is always going to listen to the people who have got the cash and the motivation to make change. And I think that's really an interesting one, where the sort of, the grassroots can leapfrog straight to the power. Another one is universities. Often universities have got a stronghold. They've got a very refined relationship with the city, and the city may look to the university as a kind of exemplar of having affected positive change, of bringing people into a city, bringing young people into a city. So I think that sort of exercise is really good. And then you're already taking it on yourself. Just to do that quick mapping, you're already forming, you yourself is kind of driving something. And I think it's from processes like that, simple mapping processes, that you, for example, if you wanted to do that, you'll talk to someone else, and you'll talk to someone, and something starts to happen, I think. And also you get outputs because you've got these maps. And then I think the process, once the process exists, the project is real. And I think we tend to think the project is only real when the construction starts, but it's not. As soon as there's some kind of loose organization and some output, which can be maps, I think you have a live project, and that's quite exciting.
I think there was a really good example in the city I lived in for 10 years, Columbus, Ohio, very large university town, but a lot of major employers there They wanted to attract people back to the city who'd gone to that university, get them off the coasts, right? Get them out of Chicago, get them back into the middle of America, because it was an inexpensive city to live in and they wanted talent. So banks, insurance companies, tech companies all got together and said, what is it that young people want? Well, they want a running trail, right? They want a bike trail. They want a place, like they want greenways. They want good sports facilities. They want quality of life. These are all the things they can't get in, say, in New York City or in Chicago or whatever. And they want to be back with their families, whatever the motivation was. And then they rebuilt the entire Olentangy River. They started with the Olentangy River. They started removing dams. They made the natural fluctuation of the river back. The university worked with them. And they created a whole new park space all the way through the center of the city, down south. And then they started moving into the other rivers, into 5 other rivers, because they just got going. But that came from the corporations and some landscape architects at The Ohio State University, students. The students were all generating those scenarios, visualizing them, and just understanding what's the benefit going to be. If it's possible to kayak from Scheta to Ortachala, imagine, right? What if that's possible? Or what if we can get more protection from catastrophic floods by changing these things, right? But we are in a condition right now where, somebody can put a HESI somewhere, anywhere they want, right? They can put a hydro dam somewhere. They can build right up to the edge of the river, because nobody has shown what we're losing. No one has made that visualization. And I think we've got AI now, right? You have all these ways to do this. So I think what Peter said about these mappings and then bringing that visualization into people's minds. And once that picture's there, it's really durable and it gets other people excited.
I think it's a really exciting and healthy thing to do. Like, by the time you've thought of this and you see this as an issue, I think that's, a wonderful thing you can do.
Yeah.
If you're a citizen of a city, to just imagine change. Quite often I go into schools and we set projects to kids, and first thing we say, or I would say, is, so when you woke up this morning to where you are now, everything you touched, someone made a decision for it to be that way. The window, the door handle, the route you went to school, the chair you're sitting on. It might not have been the right decision, but somebody made that decision. There's very little of the world that you will have experienced between your bedroom and sitting here with us now that somebody didn't make the decision. Then we say, and now we're going to let you make all the decisions in this project. And it's really fascinating, especially if it's kids who are from a situation where maybe it feels very limited. And maybe you could say it's unfair because it's not really real. But when they realize that nothing is actually a given, that somebody had to make some kind of set of decisions on the doorbell, everything you touch and look at, and then you give them a permission to imagine other scenarios, I think that's a very, very healthy sort of way of thinking about your life. And that's why I think this thing that you suggested, that the community understands they can think in that way, instead of assuming that the city is going to tell them and we know they can't. I mean, I think that just makes a much more mentally healthy condition. I think you should try. I think you should have a go. Because you'll find something really weird set of unexpected things comes out of it.
I mean, if we could plug into your brain right now and put it, we would see exactly how beautiful the river is going to be in the city, right?
And as I said before we had all these bureaucratic layers, that's just the way it works, how animals do it. They don't sit there waiting to be told how they make their nest. You just get started. And not all animals work in just a pair. Some animals work that way in communities, and we would have done that. And I think it's just very straightforward. It's tangible. It's complex in lots of ways, and then it's also incredibly direct and straightforward in other ones. It's sort of how so many issues are. We have to just somehow step outside of what we're in to be able to see that it's a bit more possible than we might think.
And patient.
Yeah, and bumpiness.
Bumpiness, yes.
But bump is good too.
Yeah.
Turbulence can be scintillating, but it can be, painful.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it.
I think it
for-
sounded...
That was
Yes,
great
thank-
questioning, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Ah?
Great
Great
question.
Yes,
questions.
all the
Really
questions,
terrific.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.